good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I'm SKippy and welcome to part 2 of the Dumas Hurricane build. So part 2 we're going to cover the building of the fuselage. It's going to take a little bit longer to do than the wings, which have gone well if you haven't seen part 1 of the videos. This time I'm going to be building around the plan obviously, but I'm going to have to consider where I put the receiver, where I put the servos, how I create the battery hatch, and also how I mount the motor. The way that the Dumas kit is built up, it's around a box frame. Show a picture here. And then I've got to try and work out how to fit the hatch, cut the fewer formers that are in there, and also strengthen it for that, whereas on previously with the Gwillows they have a nice convenient thicker piece of balsa down the centre on each side which you can then mount the hatch onto. So I'm not quite sure how I'll do it just yet. I'm thinking of doing it in this position. I'll show you the picture there. So that's roughly what I'm going to do. As I've talked about before, using the photocopies that I created beforehand, I'm going to cut a few spare pieces of those parts 1, 2, 3, 4 because I will be using those to create the hatch, and obviously we need to have spare ones. So based on the Gwillows builds, I have an idea of how I'm going to build the hatch, but I'm not quite sure how I'm going to fix it onto this frame because it is subtly different the way it's constructed, but we'll give it a go, and obviously as I go I'll share with you. Okay, as I build the fuselage it'll be pretty much as per the plan and instructions that came with the kit. Obviously with some subtle differences. I'll be looking to put the hatch in where you see the formers 2, 3 and 4. So I'll need spares of those. I've got the photocopies, so I'll cut that out, cut spare ones. I've then got to work out with the box frame how I attach or how I mount the servos and the receiver into the fuselage. Also how I mount the motor, because unlike the Gwillows kits which had a nice firewall, this one doesn't. But I think having had a look at it roughly that the motor should fit nice on the front, but I'll probably have to strengthen it. And also where the battery goes, it will be losing some lateral strength because I won't be having the small bits of balsa between the fuselage sides. So I may actually look at putting solid sheet in there. Again, I'm not quite sure yet. It's going to be very much build it and adjust as I go through to see what works best. So this is the pictorial guide of how to build the fuselage, obviously starting with the 2 box sections shown here, putting them together, and then putting on the formers to then add the stringers on top. However, I will be moving 2, 3 and 4 because that's where I anticipate the battery hatch going, so these are the ones I need to make spares of. But it's this piece in here where I'm going to have to work out how to strengthen it, because obviously they won't be there, otherwise the battery won't fit. So I just need to have a little think about that. As I said in my intro piece, we'll see how it goes. Okay, before I do anything else, I'm going to laminate this section of the box frame. So you can see I'm pinning one piece of the 32nd square. I'm then going to glue another piece around it and pin it in and allow it to dry. That way hopefully it'll hold its shape and all will be good. Okay, using a Yoo-hoo glue stick, I've applied to the one side of the second piece of 32nd square. I've slowly bent it around the first piece. It all looks nice and neat. We'll need a little bit of sanding just where it's not quite level in all places. And now I'm going to apply some thin CA glue to seal it, then just leave it for a good half an hour just to make sure it sticks, and then see if this works. Rather than forcing the wood round and gluing it, what I've done this time is I've wet the balsa, I've pinned it in place, but I've not glued it yet, so I'm hoping that it will then, as it dries, retain some of that shape. I can then glue it together easier and stand less chance of snapping. Result of the other one, that was the one that I glued and then pinned in place. That's not too bad, I had to sand it down a bit. Bit of flex. I'm hoping though this version will be better. Okay, I've made 2 of these laminated parts that fit on the box frame. This was my first one, and as you can see it's not held its shape. That one I just used dry balsa, pinned it and glued it in place. The second one I made has held its shape a lot better, and that was when I wet it, pinned it and then glued it in place. But it was a bit of a faff. Now on the Gwillows kits it's just made out of one solid piece of balsa, so that's what I'm going to try next and see how that looks and goes. First laminate attempt, second laminated attempt, third attempt, single piece cut out of the correct thickness. That only took 5 minutes. That took a good hour, allowing it all to dry, or in fact longer than that. That one took about the same and didn't work as well. Also, by using this, it's spare balsa strip that I already have, or sorry, sheet that I already have. I'm going to use that method and do the second one. Top tip before you start building on the other side like I did, turn the page over to where the wing plan was and you'll find a much easier plan for the square section to be built. And it does actually show that you need to splice the longeron there. So there we go, turn over the page. Okay, before I start building the first side of the inner box for the fuselage, obviously I'm using the piece that I've cut from one solid rather than the laminated where the wing sits. I've glued these two strips in place. And rather than cut and build as I go, I've measured and cut all the pieces ready. Because obviously once you start building and sticking onto the plan, it's going to be very difficult to cut and measure the pieces accurately. So yeah, cut them out first and I'll start to glue them in one by one. Okay, that's the first side of the fuselage complete. I've also included the 2 degrees down thrust, so hopefully that will work nice and neatly. So yeah, so far so good. Now to build the other side. Okay, that's the fuselage sides completed, and as I did with the wing, I just want to make sure that they are as near symmetrical as possible. So I've overlaid one on top of the other, and actually I'm pretty pleased with how they've come out. I've smoothed them down, made it all nice and level. So yeah, very pleased with those. So tomorrow I'll get on to actually joining them together. But yeah, looking good. Okay, the next phase is to fix the 2 fuselage sides together. So first I've pinned the one. I've cut out the joining stringers that are going to go in between, which are shown by the solid lines. And what I've also done is I've marked them with a piece of red pencil so that I know which side up when I stick them down, because some of them, as they come to this end, have a slight curve in them, so I want to make sure that they all fit neatly. So what I'm going to do now is pin the second half of the fuselage on, and I'm going to glue those pieces into, or the braces into place, and leave that for a bit while it dries, make sure it's all nice and stuck, because obviously there's a bit of tension with this balsa being bent in this position. So that's what I'm going to do next. Okay, to fit these cross braces in, what I'm actually doing is using my scalpel, making sure I've got the pencil on the right area. I'm doing a dry fit test first, then applying CA glue to each end, then using the scalpel to slide it in place, put the pressure on from both sides and then remove the scalpel. That seems to be fixing it quite neatly. Okay, we've now finished building the box frame. Quite pleased with it. Showed a few pictures. Really symmetrical all the way down. Sanded it all down, smoothed it off, and I've got to start working out how I actually put the the formers in to make the rest of the fuselage. And this is where I'm going to have to start thinking about which bits I'm going to cut. Just showing you here that photocopying does work. It's pretty accurate round for those 2 parts. I now need to work out which ones I'm going to have to make copies of to build the battery hatch, which should fit in here. I'll get back to that in a second. Okay, so when we put the fuselage over the plan, what I'm aiming to do is put the battery hatch between 2 and 5. So I'm going to need to make copies of 2, 3, 4 and 5 so that I can cut them to make the hatch removable. And I'm anticipating building this up a little bit so that the hatch will fit on top. It'll definitely be wide enough. I just need to have a play around with it and obviously cut these 2 out now once I've put in formers 1 and 2 just to strengthen the fuselage body. But that's the plan. This is probably going to take me a couple of days because I don't want to get it wrong, and it's getting late this evening, so I shall look at this tomorrow. Okay, so we've got the fuselage frame, the box section made. I'm now looking to create the battery hatch, which, as I said previously, is going to go between 2 and 5. So what I'm looking at is need to trim down 3, about that section there. That will form, and then I'll use this piece in the hatch. 4 I'll use in the hatch. I need to make another 5 so that that rests up against this 5, and I also need to make a top section of 2 so that the battery hatch slots in against 2, slots in against 5, and I use the existing 3 and 4. So I just need to make 2 new pieces, and as we did earlier, I'd photocopied the sheets, so I will use those now to make some new parts. Okay, I've created the 2 new parts, I've cut those out. So now, and I've also trimmed former 3, so now these 4 components here will make the top of the battery hatch. This will butt up against here, the stringers will be joined up just between these 4 pieces, then this piece will butt up against that piece. So now you'll see the hatch will fit here to there, which is big enough for the battery to fit into. I now need to build the frame, start putting the formers into here, so that I can then work out exactly how I will attach the hatch onto this. And also I'll probably need to clear away another couple of these top formers. Okay, so I've made the 2 additional pieces for the battery hatch, which we've already seen. We're going to fit it between here and here, hence the 4. Having made a photocopy, cut out the pattern, so that's how it will all fit on. I'll put the ribs on here, but what I'm going to do now using this pattern is create 2 flat pieces, which I'll then cut out a hole. The first one I'll glue to the frame, and that will add a bit of extra strength. The second one then I'll use as a base to create the removable hatch. These will then be glued onto it. I'll need to adjust the depth of these to allow for the depth of the wood that's going to go in there. And that will then fit nicely in, much like I did on my other models. So I'm going to get on with that now. Okay, so using the paper template, I've now cut out the base piece for the hatch, glued that in place, and cut a hole out big enough for the battery to fit through. And I've also shaped it better with the fuselage frame. I've then taken a second piece here, which will be the base of the hatch. I've also cut the hole in that, not quite as big this time, and I've shaped that to fit over nicely and fit in between the ribs that way, formers. And then taking the 2 pieces extra I've cut, I've reduced them in height and sanded them down so that they will fit neatly on here, and I will glue those in place. I'll also sand them down a little bit more as necessary. I now just need to trim 3 and 4, which will fit over this piece, put the stringers on, and then that'll be the battery hatch built. I then need to just decide how I'm going to fit it in permanently, but that's quite a nice fit. Okay, to start gluing the hatch, I've used some greaseproof paper, put it in between the base and the base of the hatch and the actual piece of the fuselage, put the parts 5 and 2 up against it, made sure they're centered as best as possible, and then I've glued it with some CA. I'll then remove that and then get ready to position the remaining 2. Okay, to make sure that I've trimmed those centre or those middle 2 formers, I've just used some glue stick just for now, and then I can gently rest the thin balsa within the centre section, and it keeps that nice smooth curvature down towards the nose, so I'm happy with that. So what I'll now do is CA those 2 bits in and start putting the stringers on the hatch. Okay, this is the hatch finished. Blends in quite nicely, keeps the line of the fuselage. Comes off as well, no dramas. So I just now need to decide how I'm going to actually get it to stay on there whilst it's flying. Probably use magnets like I did before, though I have been toying with the idea of attaching hinges maybe, and then having it do that. We'll see. If I do that and then just one magnet, it might be a bit easier, although they may be a bit unsightly. But I shall have a play around with that. To mount the battery hatch and fix it, unlike when I've done the previous models, I've used dowels and magnets. What I've done this time is use the magnet here. It's quite a firm grip, but on the other side I've used a hinge, plastic hinge, which I can remove just by removing that copper pin. So now it just slides over, clicks into place. Nice fit, doesn't disrupt it too much. There's a bit of a gap there, so what I might do is put a bit of balsa inside just to seal that up, stop the wind getting under it. But yeah, that's a nice easy way of doing the hatch, and you can take it off. You don't lose it on the flying field, it doesn't blow away like's happened with some of my others. So all being well, that'll be a nice new amendment to my builds. To mount the magnet, I've just drilled a small hole, pushed the magnet in and then glued it in place on both sides, making sure that I have the right poles coming together. And for the hinge, I've used a small file, put a groove into the wood and sunk the hinge into it, and it fits nicely. I can't get rid of the whole gap, which you see here, because there's a bit of movement in the hinge, but I think that'll do good. So now, according to the plan, I should really be putting those parts onto the main fuselage and creating the frame, but I'm still not quite sure yet where I'm going to put the receiver and obviously the servos for the tail section. So what I'm going to do first is build the stringers underneath, so build the bottom section, so I've still got access to the side and to the top. The stringers on the bottom, I can then see what space I have, and also where I can build in any extra supports or platforms that I'll put them onto. So I'm going to do the underneath first. As you can see, I've now started putting the stringers on the actual fuselage. I'm only doing the underside because I want to know how much space I have internally to mount the battery, the motor, the SC and the servos and receiver, etc. Obviously the battery is going to go in here. Centre of gravity is roughly here, so it's quite far forward, so I'm going to try and get the receiver in this position and the servos for the elevator and rudder not too far from there as well. Obviously the battery is quite heavy with the motor, so I'm hoping that'll not to be too difficult to balance out. So I've put on the stringers at the front and the underneath. Now I'm going to work out where to mount the servos and receiver. Okay, so I've made the plate that the receiver will sit on and the two servos are mounted into. You'll note from here now that actually I've made the hole bigger so that I could have the servos side by side and the arms would actually rotate without conflicting with each other. I had them too close earlier, so I just filed it down. I've glued them in place because obviously once the rest of the fuselage is built I won't be able to access them anyway, so I don't need to be able to remove them, they just need to work, which they do. I've added some extra bolster on the side just to give more contact for the plate to stick to, so that's nice and firm in the fuselage now, and it doesn't interfere with the wing. I obviously dry fitted it to make sure. So that's all done. Now I need to put the stabiliser in place and the rudder just to see where the control rods are going to go to, and I'm going to try not to cross them over on this build. Okay, if you watch part one, I built the stabiliser when I did the wing, and I made a bit of a rookie error. Built the stabiliser or the elevator like this, and obviously the original plan it wasn't designed to move, so I've cut it out using the original form, but of course I forgot that it needs to be able to rotate up and down, and with this extra bolster in the centre it doesn't, so I'm going to need to trim that out and either put metal wire in between or just try and join the two halves of the elevator together. So I'm going to now have a look at that and then I'll get back to you. Okay, so I'll show a few photographs of how I made this fix, but all is not lost. Managed to add the piece of wire in, bent it beforehand, made sure it was all going to fit, and then trimmed the elevator into half, and then it's all super glued in. It's nice and straight, and the advantage now is when it's in position it will now rotate, which is what we're after. So that I can work out the height of the stabilizer and therefore where I want to run the push rod to, I actually need to install this section here. But obviously the issue with that is I need to put in the formers, and this one's going to get in the way. So what I'm going to do is put in the other formers to glue it in place, but I'm not going to glue this one in place so that I can access the screws and the push rods. Once they're done and it's all connected up, then I'll glue this one in place. So again, a little bit out of sequence, but it's just necessary so that I can get the right height for the stabilizer. Okay, I've powered up the servos to make sure they're centered, worked out that's the best position for the arms, put in the links for the rods to go through, and then when I thread it through, they know not crossing over. This nearest one will be for the rudder, and the other side here will be for the elevator. The elevator, that's roughly the right height now that I've set it, and obviously the rudder will drop down a bit. What I want to try and do though is to stop the wires bending when under a bit of load, so I'm probably going to put some sheet balsa in here, in this spot here, to run the rod through, which will then help keep it straight when the servos are actuated. So I'll look at doing that next. As you can see now, I've added the side stringers on to go with the bottom stringers, but still I think before I can start doing the upper fuselage stringers, I need to be able to fit the wires in there, because as pointed out, once this piece of wood is in, I won't be able to get to the screws. So I need to be able to fix those properly first, and to do that I really need to put in the rear stabilizer and rudder. Now I've tried before papering a model once it's built, and it's quite tricky, so what I'm going to do is paper the stabilizer and rudder first, paper this rear section, glue them on, then I can run the wires through, work out where the holes are, whether I need to bend them or not, fit them into the servo, then I can complete building the rest of the stringers and finishing off the fuselage before I then move to the front to work out exactly how to mount the motor and where to position the SC. You can see from here that the wire addition to the elevator has worked. That gives full movement. So I think I'm going to cover the stabilizer and rudder, cover this rear section here, glue them on, and then I can install the servos properly before I go on to finish building the fuselage. The choice of tissue paper to cover these parts really doesn't matter, because I'm going to be painting the aircraft anyway no matter what. But being as I've got some tan tissue that came with the box, and I possibly might do a desert scheme, I'll cover it with this paper first. The way I normally do it, and a lot of you probably do, is a little bit of the Yoo-hoo stick on the leading edge, trailing edge, cut the tissue paper roughly sized or just oversized, do it down. I'll do the underneath first and then the upper surface over the top, so that the overlap goes down and underneath rather than on the top. Just looks a bit neater. But I'll do some photos as I go. This is the first side of the tissuing done on the tailplane, the rudder and the stabilizer. I've stuck it using the Yoo-hoo pitch stick. I've used the shiniest side that I can feel on the paper to be inside, so on the glue itself, so the rougher side on the outside for when I'm painting it. I'm going to let this properly dry, trim the paper down, then stick the other side on. After that, I'll then wait for that to dry properly, shrink it with some water, and that'll be it for now. I won't dope it until I've actually put it on the aeroplane. The rear section of the fuselage has been covered and shrunk down so that I can look at putting the stabilizer and rudder on. Stabiliser and rudder are nicely covered and tissue pretty good too. And now I'm going to cut the slots in the actual wood now for the mylar strip, which I'll make the hinges, probably 3 for the rudder and then 2 on each side for the elevator. I will fix the elevator together so that I can then put it on the fuselage. I'll then stick the rudder on top of the elevator because this is going to go over this section here, hence putting the elevator incomplete, and then I'll affix the rudder. Once those are in place and properly dried, then I can look at running the rods, push rods through to the servos, get all that tightened up nicely, and then I can put the stringers on the top section and that missing former too. Using a sharp scalpel, I've cut slits into the wood carefully, trying not to break it. I've then used thin CA and glued in one side so that they don't move when I slide the pieces together. I'll now slide the elevator onto the main stabiliser and glue that in place. Then with the rudder, I'll put the fin on top of the stabiliser once it's glued onto the fuselage, and then the same way that I've attached the elevator to the stabiliser, I'll attach the rudder to the aircraft, and then I can get on with putting the push rods in. Before I glue the elevator on, I'm going to make sure that obviously it moves up and down. There's enough space for it to move. Difficult to do it one-handed, but you get the idea. There's a little gap. I want to have as small a gap as possible, but it needs to be big enough to allow the elevator to move. So I'll now fiddle with that and then glue the elevator into place. Okay, elevator and rudder are now fixed onto the fuselage. I've moved the elevator, you see it moves nicely up and down here. Rudder, no problems at all. Just got to make sure that when you're fitting it on that you get it as square as possible. I'm pretty chuffed with how that's gone on. And the reason for covering the rear fuselage like I did earlier is so that you get a much nicer seal around the top there. Obviously where it's dark you can see where I've spilled over with the CA glue. I've also in preparation made holes for the control horns, because it's easier to do that while it's on the bench rather than once it's on the model. So what I'm now going to do is put the wire through the control horns, thread it through the fuselage onto the servos, and then see how I need to adjust the wire. Another thing to do before you do that is make sure that you drill the hole in the servo horn, sorry, on the control horn slightly bigger to fit the wire, otherwise it won't. I'll have to drill that through, same diameter as the wire. Okay, I've glued on the tail surfaces properly, fitted the control horn, the control rods. I've also used a bit of carbon tube there to run the wire, the push rods through the fuselage. A bit of rigidity would also make it easier and not wear the wood out. Smaller piece here on the back. And I've also Loctited the little screws into the bolts there, because once, as I said before, once it's in, I won't be able to move it. So if I move the rudder, nice unrestricted movement, same with the elevator. Just need to reverse that one. Rudder's working well. So now that that's all working and I confirmed it works, I can now continue building the top decking of the turtle deck. Okay, I've added the stringers on top of the fuselage now, and I must say I'm very pleased with it. I think it looks great. Not the work I've done, just the shape of it and the way it's all been put together as a kit, but you can see I was right to make sure I joined up the push rods, etc. before I put the top on, because trying to get to those screws would be very tricky. You could obviously push them further forwards if you wanted, but that would then get in the way of the receiver, and I want to make sure that I've got enough space for the battery in the ESC. I haven't quite decided how far forward I'll put the receiver, but again, as I go, I will decide. But yeah, that's all done, nice and sorted, very happy. Next step is to decide how to mount the motor. Obviously this is the motor here, ESC. This is the balsa part that comes with it already, which fits nicely in there. I've not put the stringers on top because I don't know whether I need access or not. When I put the motor on, it's roughly the right position to fit with the plastic cowl that comes with it. I'll just need to mount it further forwards, so I'm not too sure about mounting it directly to the balsa. Something, and I might use a bit of plasticard, screw the motor to that plasticard and then glue it securely onto this piece of balsa, which will then act as the connection point to here. This has already got the 2 degree down thrust added in, which is great. And then that's what I'm thinking, but I'm going to have a play with that now and see how it goes. To mount the motor, I've taken the original balsa part. I've measured it out with the motor itself, so looking at the screws I'm going to use on the back. Drilled the holes using a piece of the plastic card that came with my old Grillos. Made that firmer, so that's something more, well, something stronger to screw into. That will then fit over the top of the wood. Motor bolts on, this glues on top of that, and then the balsa part here fits nicely into there. I've left a slot for the wire to come through. That will feed in, that will all glue on, and then hopefully the motor is nice and secure, ready to go, and then be connected to the ESC in that compartment with the battery, receiver there, and then all the other wires fitting into it. So as you can see, I've fixed the motor mount now onto the main fuselage. It's gone on nice and neatly. Put the wires through, connected the ESC, and tucked the wires up inside that front section. The ESC in here will tuck nicely sideways. The battery will fit down the centre, down the side with it and connect. I can now put the formers on here and finish that off. What I then need to do is reshape or shape the front mount here so that the cone fits on. I've connected the wires, and before I put the stringers on top, I've also connected it up to the ESC and to the transmitter or receiver, to make sure that the prop spins the correct way, which it does. So that's all set up, ready to go. So when I eventually put the receiver in to the model, I know that everything is going the right direction. The same with the servos there. So yes, all good. I'll now put these stringers on here, and then that's the fuselage 99% built. Rather than trying to bend this piece of balsa at the front of the canopy, I've replaced it with some foam board, much easier to shape and glue, much more malleable, and it'll do the job. So with the stringers on the front now, the final bit is to confirm that the prop fits nicely. I've adapted a 2-blade spinner, removed that back plate, created another one of my own, using again some of the plastic from the Grillos kit. That mounts nicely. There's plenty of space for the prop to rotate. Obviously this is held on with tape now just so I can see it fits, but that all looks nice and neat. Canopy fits on nicely up there. It's a little bit too far back at the back, but it'll do. I can't really move it forwards because of the hatch here. The hatch obviously will be pinned, it'll be nice and neat. But yeah, we now have the whole Huracan fuselage complete. So the next stage will be the covering of it, and then the putting together of this with the wing, setting it all up, and then the fun part of painting it. So yeah, that's the fuselage complete. Hopefully that's been helpful. Lots of little steps, taking a bit longer than I hoped, but yeah, I'm pretty pleased with how it's all turned out in the end. Well, thank you for watching. That's the end of part 2, the fuselage build. Obviously there are a couple of things left to stick on, such as the antenna, the rear wheel and the keel at the back there. I'll do that though once it's all covered and before I paint it. So hopefully you found all of that useful, learned from some of my mistakes, sorted out the elevator as well. And then the next video will probably take a little bit longer because I need to order the paint, plus I'm going to be away for a short while. Hopefully in a couple of weeks time I'll come back to you with the covering and painting video, and then it will all be complete. So yeah, so far so good. Hope that you've enjoyed it, and if you have, please like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video. Thank you.